For a river on the brink of death, this sounded insane. But in the late 1990s, on the bank of the Cairn in Wester Ross, Bob Kindness was releasing the first 5,000 captive-reared juveniles into the water. Scotland was trying to save a fish it had almost none of left. 5,000 was a beginning. By 2001, there would be 150,000 a year. And then something would happen that no one standing beside those rearing trays on that autumn morning had anticipated. On a morning in September 1998, Bob Kindness stood knee-deep in the River Cairn holding a 30-centimeter male salmon. The fish shuddered and he let it go. That day it was the only fish he saw. For the entire season, 6. In the 1880s, when fishery inspectors appointed under Victoria first began systematic counts, the rivers of Wester Ross and Sutherland were recording between 300 and 600 adult salmon per season on each small river. By the 1970s, that number had fallen to 100, by the 1990s to 20, on some rivers to single figures. Scientists at the Atlantic Salmon Trust, who have tracked populations since 1971, calculated that around 1.2 million individuals were then returning to Scottish shores each year. By the early 2000s, 360,000, a fall of 70% in 30 years. The causes arrived one after another like railway carriages. Industrial trawling in the open sea was intercepting fish still on their migration route toward the Faroe Islands. Felling of riverside woodland removed shade and river water temperatures rose, and salmon do not spawn in warm water. Every farm upstream, every drainage pipe, every channel straightened for agricultural land took away a few more meters of spawning grounds. The spawning grounds went, the juveniles went, there was no one left to return, and within a generation, people no longer knew how many there should have been. Official research by Marine Scotland showed that the contribution of hatchery fish to catches on the Spey ran from 0 to 1.8%. Across the country as a whole, less than 2.5%. Hatchery fish returned 10 times less often than wild fish, competed with them for food, and diluted local genetics. By the early 2000s, most programs had been closed as futile. The Cairn continued. The Spey hatchery was costing its board up to £120,000 a year and was producing a handful of fish from thousands stocked. The board began reviewing the program. On the Cairn, there was no board with a budget to conduct any review. Bob Kindness ran Seafield College in Keishorn, a small fisheries and land management college on the shore of Loch Cairn, and simultaneously managed the fishing estate at Attadale. From 1995, he had been trying to catch the last wild females and strip their eggs, but so few fish remained that in the best year he could raise 9,000 juveniles. Not enough for anything. What could you take from a river where there was nothing to catch? He spent 7 days a week on the river, 52 weeks a year. "I bought my last pair of shoes 20 years ago," he told journalists. "I'm always in rubber boots." It was a man in rubber boots against a government institution with a budget and scientific advisors. Researcher James Butler, from what was then the Institute of Freshwater Research, surveyed the bed of the Cairn and identified the root cause. The winter floods of the 1990s had displaced gravel deposits in key spawning pools. Fine gravel, into which females bury their eggs, had covered the coarser material beneath, and oxygen had stopped reaching the redds. The eggs were suffocating inside their own membranes. The mechanism was simple and brutal. The water had grown warmer, the floods had grown stronger, and the gravel had stopped lying where it had always lain. Kindness proposed something that struck even himself as half-mad. Build a hatchery on the estate, catch the last wild Cairn females, collect the eggs, rear the juveniles in controlled conditions, and release them back into the river every year until the river either recovered its spawning grounds by natural means or until, in the less realistic scenario, the population became self-sustaining. On the River Dee, less than 200 kilometers from the Cairn, the hatchery at Dinnet was closed after juveniles and parr stocked into tributaries produced no measurable increase in returning adults. In 2016, an independent study commissioned by the River Dee Trust and conducted by Queen's University Belfast and the University of Stirling stated the conclusion plainly. Stocking the Dee is inadvisable at any life stage of the fish. The reasons given were risk to the wild population, high cost, and low probability of obtaining a license. On the Spey that same year, genetic analysis of 8,626 caught fish showed that only 40 originated from the hatchery. 40 fish. That result stood against a program that cost the board up to £120,000 a year. And it was on precisely this data that Marine Scotland Science built its official position. Marine Scotland Science, the government body that regulates fisheries, did not support a program in which fish were held in captivity from birth to spawning entirely in fresh water without going to sea for two reasons. First, captive reared fish were believed to lose the ability to survive in wild water. Second, years of breeding the same captive individuals threatened the genetic diversity of the population. Both arguments rested on real research, and both failed to account for one thing. On the Cairn, there was no longer any alternative. In 2001, Kindness changed his approach. Instead of catching wild females each season, he began holding broodstock entirely in freshwater at the hatchery station at Attadale, a concrete pavilion the size of a small garage where eggs matured in rearing trays fed by running water. The first year under the new system produced 150,000 juveniles. The critical difference was genetic. Most hatcheries drew fish from wherever was convenient, often from other rivers or from farms. Kindness used only females caught on the Cairn itself and kept each one for a single season only to prevent the genetic drift that comes with captivity. This meant the fish that returned were returning to exactly where they had come from. He released them in autumn, not in spring as most programs did, but in September, when the water is colder and fewer predators are working the shallows. Each autumn, Kindness walked the river with buckets. The juveniles, 3 to 4 centimeters long, nearly transparent with a dark lateral stripe, were tipped from transport tanks into buckets and then into the water. He released them in shaded spots where the current was slower and the gravel finer, the places where wild females had once dug their redds. Each juvenile touching river water held still for a moment, then moved under a stone. Kindness stood and watched. He did this every year, and every year he did not know how many of them would reach the sea. The average survival rate is 3 to 5%. From 150,000 fish, that means between 4,500 and 7,500 fish. But the number only meant something if they returned. And they returned 3 to 4 years later, which meant the first results from the 2001 cohort could not be seen before 2005 at the earliest. Those years between the river and the return are the darkest part of the story. A smolt goes to sea and vanishes. It crosses the North Sea, reaches the Faroe Islands or the waters off Greenland. Each fish goes somewhere different. There it encounters trawlers, seals, warming water, diminishing food. Of each generation, 2 to 5% return. The rest the sea takes. Kindness could not control that part. He could only send as many as possible. But even if 1,000 return, that is more than 6. The 5-year average on the Cairn in 2001 stood at 10.6 individuals per season. By 2020, it was 187, according to Marine Scotland Science. In 2019, anglers recorded 317. But the real surprise came from somewhere no one had been looking. In 2021, the University of the Highlands and Islands completed a study Kindness had been preparing for 10 years. A DNA analysis of returning fish. Using a method called parentage-based tagging, scientists compared the genetic material of returning adults against samples from specific hatchery cohorts and tracked which fish in the river were direct descendants of the hatchery. The result was unexpected, even for supporters of the program. Kindness had hoped to confirm that hatchery fish were surviving and returning. He got that confirmation. But the study showed something else. It was not because the hatchery was producing better fish. It was because it was producing enough fish to refill the spawning pools with wild progeny. Eggs from hatchery fish were repopulating gravel in pools where spawning had previously failed. Hatchery juveniles were surviving and returning. But their offspring, the children of now wild fish that had emerged from those same pools, were showing higher survival rates than the first hatchery generation. It was not the hatchery that saved the Cairn. The hatchery gave the river time to restart its own wild cycle. In November 2025, Trout and Salmon magazine published a detail that surprised even long-standing supporters of the program. In certain years, more than half of the entire Cairn catch consisted of fish that had come directly from Kindness's hatchery at Attadale. Not descendants, but the actual fish from the Attadale rearing trays, Fish that had reached the sea survived and returned. This meant that without the hatchery, the river in those years would have been nearly empty. This was something Kindness had not planned for. Marine Scotland Science had warned of the risks of hatchery fish, and they were right about the details. But they had not seen the other half of the picture. A hatchery is not a replacement for natural spawning. It is a bridge toward it. Not fish instead of the river. A bridge while the river restores itself. The population had fallen so low that the fish was on the edge of extinction, Kindness said after the publication of the study in December 2025. But once the program was running, a clear correlation appeared between the number of juveniles released and the number of fish returning. In November 2025, the University of the Highlands and Islands study was officially published by the Cairn Conservation Association. It was the first case in Britain where a long-term stocking program had undergone full scientific verification using genetic tagging after 30 years of practice, not 3 years of a pilot. The rivers Dee and Spey, large benchmark Scottish watercourses where hatcheries were closed in the 1990s on the advice of the same government consultants who considered stocking counterproductive, began negotiations in 2024 about opening new hatchery stations. The Dee is returning to an idea it rejected 25 years ago to catch the last wild females, preserve the eggs, and give the river one more chance. Kindness himself understood partway through the program that the hatchery was a half measure. Alongside the juvenile releases, the Cairn Conservation Association planted 370,000 trees on the Glencairn estate, restoring shade over the water, without which river temperatures would have continued rising and spawning would have remained unstable. The hatchery and the forest worked together. In the Orkney Islands in 2023, a DNA bank of local salmon genotypes was established, an insurance repository for rivers where recovery is already in doubt. In Argyll, another was set up. In Lochaber, a third was created. This was a new logic of conservation. Do not wait for the river to recover on its own, and do not hope someone else will run a program. Preserve the genetic material now, while there is still something left to preserve. Kindness had been doing this on the Cairn since 1995, when no one yet called it a bank. He simply caught the last females and did not let them go to waste. But the Cairn also made clear the limits of any program. Catches from 2020 to 2023 fell. 85, 74, 61, and 57 fish per season, a mean of 69 compared with 272 in the previous decade. In 2024, the Conservation Authority downgraded the river's status to poor. Kindness did not stop work. But this is not the whole story. The Cairn is only one river on one shore of one sea. What happens to Atlantic salmon in the open water between Iceland and the Faroes is beyond the control of any hatchery in Wester Ross. In September 2023, 25 years after that morning with a single fish, Bob Kindness stood on the same riffle of the Cairn. The water was at his waist. In the place where in 1998 he had barely noticed a solitary male beneath the bank, this time he counted, unhurried, 17 fish, some of them already working the gravel and preparing to spawn. He said nothing, he just watched. But 200 kilometers to the north, on the River Brora in Sutherland, where no stocking program has ever run, the 2023 season closed with a catch of 4 fish. 4. For the entire season on the whole river. A different river, the same problem. And there is still time.